Hello there, and the warmest welcome of sorts to this Digital Foundry Direct Weekly number 240. We're recording this direct in the wake of what has been a pretty monumental week in terms of gaming news, with the arrival of new hardware from Valve and what is looking to be easily, by far and away, the most popular video we've ever done, which was ever done this year, certainly. And that is the Steam Machines Direct that Oliver put together with the two of us. This week's Direct, well, what could I say? We've been inundated with questions about Steam Machine, about the ARM translation layer, lots of stuff to talk about. So that's what we're going to be talking about this week primarily. And if there's any time to talk about things that aren't related to Valve, not that anybody seems to care at the moment, we'll talk about that too. Joining me on the panel, first of all, the man of the hour, of course, Oliver McKenzie.
Yes, Rich, the response has been extraordinary. So I'm excited to follow it up today for sure.
It's just completely outstripped our expectations.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's pretty phenomenal. And of course, Alex Battaglia, hello.
Yeah, can't get enough of Gabe, that's for certain. Also this week, featuring a new camera position. I keep optimizing. It'll change subtly every week. So this week there should be no like dancing, rocking camera kind of stuff anymore. Okay. That's gone.
I got to say, Alex, you're the master of content that's completely irrelevant to those listening to the podcast.
Yes, yeah, I'm pretty good at
that. Okay, well, let's move on to our first news topic. Well, obviously, we're going to be talking about Steam Machines and the whole Valve presentation that we had last week. But I think the first thing we really need to talk about is what wasn't revealed, which was the pricing. And wow, I mean, we're looking at a Q1 2026 release. And we've got a machine which I think is fair to say, if you looked at the top of the Steam hardware survey, the spec that they've put together is essentially very similar to, like, you know, the most popular CPU, the most popular GPU. So it's quite an interesting spec choice there. But the fact that they're unable to tell us about pricing at this time, Oliver, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about it. I went through my notes from when we discussed it, and they seem to indicate that they might not have a straightforward price for at this time, but it did seem like they were going to maybe give us more of an indication at this time, and they didn't really give us any indication as far as I'm aware, for at least for Steam Machine, a little bit more for Steam Frame, which we can talk about in a minute. But I think it's really hard to come up with a fair price for these products, in part because of DRAM pricing, which is like a global issue. And there you just have like spot prices for like DDR5 kits going up into crazy levels as, you know, the AI boom is eating up all the supply of DRAM and forcing various suppliers to retool their production lines to produce more server RAM and HBM and things like this. That's not ideal. The other issue, of course, is tariffs, where, I mean, we've talked about this a few times in the context of like the ROG Ally devices, but like it really depends on the way things are assembled, and the Section 301 tariffs apply differently if the system is a console, for instance, classified as a console, or a PC, right? That all differs. I think that the higher prices that people are suggesting, like $600 in that range, are probably a little bit more reasonable. I don't think it's going to compete necessarily with PS5 directly on price. In a really fulsome manner, maybe more closer to the Series X in terms of pricing, which itself has been inflated considerably in price since its launch there. But yeah, I think maybe a $600 price tag would be reasonable. I think they might announce some details on that in the new year, but I think a $600 price tag would be more reasonable for that system. I think the Steam controller will probably be something like $80 or $100. It's a pretty high-tech piece of kit. And then, of course, comes with the Steam machines. That might add a little bit to the bill of materials there as well. If you think about it, for Steam Frame, they've indicated that it'll be below the price in the index flat out, which is a $1,000 machine. So here I think maybe $800 or $900 would be reasonable. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense because it has unique capabilities. It can do special things with SteamOS. It can do all kinds of cool things with standalone PC games. If you want a VR gaming device, and really a VR, not XR device, and a gaming device, not a multimedia device, I think it's probably like the best thing in the market at the moment, or at least it will be when it launches in early 2026. So I think there, the price proposition, even though it's a narrower slice of a smaller market potentially, it is a really cool device that I think people are going to be really attracted to, kind of independent of that price tag almost.
Right, okay. There's a lot to wade through there. I think the entire concept of a console versus PC price differential there is raising a lot of questions, because typically, traditionally, the concept is that a console is a kind of mainstream priced device, and the cost of it is offset by the cost of software. And Valve is pretty much the only person in the only entity in the PC ecosystem that can do that, because they get, whatever it is, 30% of every software sale on Steam. So, they're in a pretty good position to actually subsidize hardware. But the only reason they would do that is if it actually brings about more games being sold, right, to offset the cost there. They could definitely do a $399 console, but it would cost them a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I've got to wonder how they'll do that. But at the same time, they did do a $399 handheld, which they did acknowledge at the time was costing them a lot of money. So it really depends on what the strategic play is. Why are they actually making the device, and will it be worthwhile for them to actually take the hit on the build costs there and effectively sell them at a loss? The problem is, I think, that when you compare it to console, you've got here a spec that is, how can I say it? It's kind of like slightly better than PlayStation 5 in some regards, but probably a fair bit worse on the GPU side. And yet it's coming out like 5 and a bit years after the PlayStation 5 for a much more expensive price point. So if the strategy here is to actually grab some console market share, I don't think that's going to happen, which kind of then brings into question, well, why are they making the device if it's not to expand the total addressable market for Steam? I think there's a lot going on there. Maybe they've been forced into some unwelcome pricing decisions by the fact that, we are in these weird times where things are costing a lot more money. Mm-hmm. On the DRAM side of things, I can't imagine Valve are paying spot price.
No.
Surely they would have allocated a supply of memory modules like a long time ago, once they'd firmed up the spec and they'd understood when they were going to release it. But I guess for future production runs, that might be a completely different story, right? Mm-hmm. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, well, there is a lot to say here. I think pricing, if you just look at this from a consumer perspective, avoiding the console comparison, I think what they're going to give you for the price is going to be lower than building the most equivalent spec'd AMD machine that you can get, because you'd be paying different kind of, I would say, fees to the motherboard manufacturer, to the case manufacturer, heatsink fan manufacturer, AMD themselves for the GPU and CPU, power supply. You're essentially going to be getting the nice subsidizing effect there on the hardware components in comparison to what you would get for building your own PC, I presume, here. That otherwise, the buy-in beyond the simplicity is not as, I would say, as enticing. I think it's got to feel like a deal, in at least for some people in some market. And I think that's going to be for those who would be maybe opting to grab a pre-built or grab their own PC that they built themselves. And I think they're going to actually target a lower price there. But whether or not they need to and will beat console pricing that we were just talking about, this like PS5-esque experience, I don't know how necessary that is, even though I would really love that to be the case. It would be amazing if there was a good enough spec'd machine that could run a lot of games and was cheap like a console is in an all-in-one form factor. That'd be wonderful. But at the same time, due to the market this may or may not be addressing, that may not be a necessity. Because like you said, if you've already only been convinced by consoles, I'm not sure this is the thing for you. But if you're a lot of those people in the Steam hardware survey who still have like GTX 1650s and really janky old Core i3s, or something like that, this upgrade for you might be really palpable from a performance perspective. And then it also might make the cost, like the one problem when you're upgrading an old PC into a new one is you're rebuilding the whole thing if you're switching motherboards. it's like why the AM4 to AM5 upgrade is always like a big question. Should we do it? Should we not? Should you not do it? And I feel like this could cover those people who are on an, really older, like Ryzen 1 series, Ryzen 2 series, older core Intel PCs with, your GTX 1060s, GTX 1650s, or even a base GTX 2060, maybe something like that, or even an older laptop. This could be an upgrade path to get you having a new PC experience that covers most games that is cheaper. And I feel like that is a market that this could also be addressing. People that have older PCs but have been waiting for so long because they don't like what they see. And that apparently, according to the Steam hardware survey, that's still a lot of people.
Right. Okay. Who is this machine for then, Oliver, based on all of that?
Well, I think it's probably for a certain kind of cost-minded consumer who's interested in a PC gaming experience, interested in trying it out in kind of a home theater type environment, and someone who maybe is coming from a system that's a little bit older, or coming from a Steam Deck. Maybe they entered the Valve ecosystem through the Steam Deck. They're looking for another kind of device. I don't think it's the kind of machine that necessarily should particularly interest current gen console users who already have a machine, are already happy there, are maybe looking forward to next generation console hardware in the future. It's more of a mass market device, but at the same time, it's critical. I don't think it's going to be at the same price level. Like I noted that right now, I think Sony is offering PS5s for £350 or $400 right? In it with a bundle with like some Fortnite package. I don't think we're going to necessarily see that level of pricing aggressiveness with this product.
Yeah, and you've got to wonder whether it is actually attempting to steal any sort of console audience, bearing in mind they're already deeply embedded in their own ecosystems with libraries of games that are not going to run on it. Although, ironically, of course, your Xbox games, if you've got Xbox Play Anywhere, you'll be able to play them on this. Really? I would have thought. Yeah. Actually, no, you wouldn't, because there's no Game Pass support for Linux. So maybe if you installed Windows on it, which kind of defeats the point of the device. But yeah, there's certainly an interesting idea of what this machine, how they actually came about the specifications. Obviously, the fact that it is essentially running older hardware, it's not really forward-looking in any way, I'd say. Is kind of down to the fact that they just want to be able to appeal to as many people in the PC space as possible via a low price point. So, if that is the whole point of the exercise, and we don't know what the pricing is, that's a bit of a big question mark over the whole endeavor at the moment. But I just think, the concept and the execution, the actual form factor of the device and some of the cute stuff that it does, it's amazing how little flourishes and cute finishing touches can actually make a product that much more appealing. So the form factor, the stuff they're doing with the replaceable face plates, all of that stuff, it kind of, what can you say? It makes it a lot more desirable compared to, your reaction to, a PC with a downclocked RX 7600 normally would be. But certainly interesting stuff. But let's move on. Let's talk about the impact to Microsoft here. It's something we've been talking about for quite some time in terms of the fact that it looks as though Valve and Microsoft are on a kind of collision course. On the one side, you have a big supporter of the PC space, obviously. Both of them are, obviously, but Microsoft, they're the stewards of Windows 11. They're really interested in bringing together Xbox and Windows 11. The Xbox Ally X kind of showed some initial ideas on how they plan to do that. Not entirely convinced based on the initial showing, whereas with Valve, they're moving SteamOS into the console space effectively, and it's doing a much better job. We've got this comment here from Phil Spencer on the launch, and let's just read the quote. Gaming moves forwards when players and developers have more ways to play and create, especially across open platforms. Expanding access across PC, console, and handheld devices reflects a future built on choice, core values that have guided Xbox's vision from the start. As one of the largest publishers on Steam, we welcome new options for players to access games everywhere. Congrats on today's announce. Oliver, where are we on this?
Well, that statement in particular, I think, is a little bit funny because he's basically saying, well, it's great to have open platforms. And then as one of the largest publishers on Steam, we welcome new players to access games everywhere. And I mean, that's true in the sense that Microsoft is a big publisher. There are a lot of big publishers on Steam. But obviously, Microsoft, they're still in the business of shipping Windows devices. They're still in the business of shipping consoles. And I think in the context of Microsoft's like broader hardware and software offerings, that kind of statement is a I don't know, possibly a bit problematic. I mean, I don't really draw too much into that, but I think you have possibly two angles to this whole discussion. And I think the narrower angle is something people have been focusing on a little bit more so with this initial announcement, which is that obviously the Steam Machine effort looks a lot like Microsoft's next-gen Xbox effort in a few different ways, right, in terms of its software offering here. Probably is fairly similar to what Microsoft wants to achieve with that effort. Now, obviously, the Steam Machine won't compete with Magnus on a hardware level. Maybe future SteamOS devices could, but obviously this is not going to be competitive with something with a reasonable RDNA 5-based GPU here. But the second point, I think, is broader, and that's basically the sense in which Valve is basically saying, here is a lineup of gaming-focused software and hardware offerings that run Windows games without Windows. They have a home theater box, a headset, and handhelds, and they're using x86 and ARM, and they have third parties involved with Lenovo, potentially other third parties involved in future Steam Machine efforts as well. So Microsoft makes a ton of money selling Windows licenses for gaming systems and getting their various apps and services, like Copilot, which I know Alex loves, onto gaming devices. And this is like a significant threat to that. I'm not going to say it's like a huge immediate threat to it because obviously these devices aren't on the market. We don't know exactly how broad Valve will go with this effort. But if you think about the broad swath of gaming devices out there, especially lower cost gaming devices that might be impacted by especially a cut price Steam Machine device or impacted by a flood of a range of Steam Machine devices, of other similar devices across the range. You obviously have impacts in the handheld space already. You might have future impacts in the handheld space with ARM processors. You might have phones running SteamOS games. I mean, there are all kinds of different avenues Valve is pushing into with this effort, where I think the ramifications of it are absolutely huge for Microsoft. So I think that is a direct threat to Microsoft's gaming business model. It's a threat to Windows, potentially. It's a threat to a lot of things. And yeah, I mean, obviously Microsoft as a third-party publisher will continue to fare reasonably well, I imagine, on Steam, and will fare reasonably well across their different platforms they're targeting games on. But that's not all they are. They're also shipping a platform. They're also shipping an operating system. They're also shipping Game Pass. They're also shipping all these other things that like are not operable, at least not currently with this effort.
Yeah, much to think about. I'm going to bring you some supporter questions here because this topic has come up, perhaps not surprisingly. Regardless asks, hello gents, exclamation point, is the Gabe Cube... Is the Gabe Cube also an Xbox? Well, Microsoft would say it is, but I think Oliver's put a convincing case forward that perhaps not. And will you include it in your benchmarks and optimized settings videos in the future? Probably not. Retro Sean asks, do you think that the Steam quote-unquote console will disrupt Microsoft's plans for Xbox? It almost seems like Valve is going to launch first in the quote-unquote console that's also a PC space. Let's talk about Regardless's question. It kind of is an Xbox if you're Microsoft, because they're saying everything is an Xbox. You can actually play Xbox Game Studio games on it. That's kind of the extent to which it is an Xbox, unless you install Windows on it, which you probably don't want to do. Retro Sean's question is possibly a bit more interesting, because from my perspective, each of these companies is coming towards the same objective, but from two very different positions. So essentially, you have Valve that have produced an entry-level box with a fully featured interface that is really, really good. And then you have Microsoft that is aiming with its Magnus APU to be a super high-end device with cutting-edge machine learning features, excellent ray-tracing performance. But as of this moment, we don't really know what the interface is going to look like, but based on what we've seen on the Xbox One Ally X, it's not particularly compelling. What do you think about that, Alex?
Wow. Well, just to really briefly get to regardless this question, I just want to say I don't think it's an Xbox, and that the idea of integrating into benchmarks and optimized settings videos is kind of like a maybe-ish. I never will promise this, but I like the idea of one sitting on my desk, and when I do optimize settings, I would just like to see how it runs on them. The optimized settings I do generate to see if it's meaningfully different than the Windows experience for some reason, or see if it's meaningfully different than my usual RTX 4060. That would be something that would be some nice commentary, and it wouldn't take too long, hopefully, to just run the settings on that device. So that could be the way it might look in a video of mine in the future. I'm going to piggyback off of what Oliver said. I think this is a direct threat to talk about Retro Sean's question. I think this is a direct threat to the Microsoft ecosystem in a great way because it's exciting people. Like usually, like this is different. Like I don't think anyone's looking at this and like hate watching the video. I think they're very interested in to see what Valve has to produce, because maybe some experience with Windows, or maybe some experience with the current hardware market is upsetting people. And I think it is, based upon the amount of rage bait you see on YouTube. And I think, that is really appealing, something like a more positive look at PC. And I feel like that is it. And it's speaking to the PC experience, it has console-like ambitions, but, you scroll down to the end of the Valve page and it says, and it's a PC. Who are we to tell you what you're supposed to do with your PC? And I really liked that little extra bit they added in there, because that's the truth of the matter. A PC, you can do you can install that terrible Windows 11 on it if you really want to. I think they are first to market here. And I said it in the last video, which I think a lot of people didn't understand, when I said, like, hey, it's interesting to see them being the pioneers of this ecosystem of the handheld form factor PC. And also they've got VR attached to it. They're kind of doing the stuff that both PS5 and Sony and Microsoft want to do in their next generation, but they're doing it earlier than them. With, they've already got their Steam Decks out there. They're going to be bringing this out there. Microsoft and, oddly enough, Sony are going to be playing a little bit of catch up in some degree, at least, in terms of getting the hardware out. And especially for Microsoft, having a software bed that actually works and makes sense, which I have yet to be convinced of at all. I actually think Valve's going to probably do a much better job for the next foreseeable few years. And having streamlined, good, reliable software. I feel like Sean. Yeah, this is definitely the first console that's also a PC, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also the other thing to bear in mind, I think Oliver alluded to this, is if you kind of like strip back the hardware announcements and look at the strategy, you are potentially looking at a situation where Valve, you talk about Microsoft saying everything is an Xbox. Well, the way things are going, everything is going to be a Steam machine of some description, because, they've got ARM covered off seemingly. We've got to say, though, that that ARM translation layer, it could obviously apply to a whole range of devices, from phones to tablets, upwards to PCs that aren't based on x86, for example. But we still need to actually test that translation layer. We've seen one in the Windows space, which at launch wasn't particularly good, but remains to be seen how good this one is. And I think, it was going to be really interesting to test that out on a range of ARM devices, especially that NVIDIA laptop when it comes about. That's going to be really interesting. I could imagine, essentially NVIDIA's been locked out of the PC gaming SoC space because they don't have an x86 license. Well, suddenly maybe they don't need one anymore. It's all going to come down to how good that translation layer is, both in its Windows and in its Linux guises. So, from a strategic perspective, that's, Valve is essentially making a move on, well, again, stealing Microsoft's lunch. They're not just just talking the talk. They're walking the walk here, because they've actually got the technologies out there, in the very immediate future, which I think is really, really interesting. We've also got the rather curious situation where the Valve machine is going to be running all of the Xbox games, and then the PlayStation games when they come out as well. On there. Which is really, really interesting. And it's to the point now, talking about everything being a Steam machine. Well, the next generation Xbox is going to allow you to access your Steam games. So again, if everything is a Steam machine, the next Xbox is going to be one as well. Which, who would have believed that a few years ago? I think that's kind of all we've got to say about that one. But let's move on to our next topic. Okay, Oliver, we need to clarify some spec points here because obviously Valve released official specifications for all of the hardware that it revealed. However, those specifications were kind of vague in some regards, and we do have some clarification now, right?
That's correct. So basically, initially, just pulling up my spec sheet here, our spec for the CPU reads CPU semi-custom AMD Zen 4 6C/12T, so 6 cores/12 threads, up to 4.8 gigahertz and 30 watts of TDP. I suggested in our video that came out a couple days ago that it was Hawk Point, and I think I got Hawk Point and Hawk Point 2 slightly confused there, and the earlier leaks did actually suggest Hawk Point 2. And the difference between Hawk Point and Hawk Point 2 is Hawk Point is basically 8 Zen 4 cores, right? 16 threads with full fat Zen 4 cores and 12 RDNA 3 CUs. And Hawk Point 2 is very similar. It's a bit smaller and it's got 6 Zen 4 cores, but 2 of those are full fat Zen 4, 4 are Zen 4C, right? Which is a reduced configuration version of Zen 4 that typically hits lower clocks. It's denser. It's not quite as fast. Clock for clock, it's about as fast, but it does not clock as highly. And then it only has a 4 CU RDNA 3 GPU, although that would be cut back, presumably. In this configuration, you're not going to see that actually enabled, right? In actual typical use if it's not completely fused off entirely. That makes some sense here. That makes a bit more sense, I would say. It's kind of a weird choice still because it's like a mobile APU, but it's probably still area efficient and cost efficient because if you think about it, if they were to go with a desktop part, that would mean a dual chip design with an IO die and a CCD, and it would probably consume more power. That's probably actually less of an ideal choice, even if you do have some redundant GPU hardware here. And there's also probably just an aspect of it where like you're rummaging through the AMD parts bin looking for just like whatever is cheap for this product, because I really do feel like cost was a big priority for Valve in terms of getting that device as cheap as possible. And also it's obviously quite power efficient. In terms of its actual impact on gaming, I'm not sure that it has that much of an impact on gaming because as long as workloads are scheduled pretty well, you'll presumably have the main threads, presumably on the big cores, and worker threads on the Zen 4C cores. And that shouldn't impact games too much because games are rarely loading up, 4, 5, 6 cores with large loads. That's not common. That happens in some esports titles, happens in some highly optimized games like Cyberpunk, does not happen in most games. So I think that will have a larger impact on non-gaming tasks potentially to the extent you engage those in the system. I don't think it necessarily has a big impact on gaming tasks. The 4.8 gigahertz clock, I'd assume that's for the big cores. I did see in the leaked spec from a few months ago that the base clock was reported as 3.2 gigahertz. So that might be, I'd assume that the 4C cores can go higher than that, but that might be like a floor for the Zen 4C cores if that's being reported correctly.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the concept of having 2 higher performing cores and 4 lower performing cores, it is obviously a bit concerning, right? But at the same time, you're quite right, Oliver, in that most games do seem to have like 2 dominant threads or even 1 dominant thread, depending on the game, which is then hiving off tasks to the others. Don't know what you think about that. I think ultimately it's going to come down to what the known titles we have that are essentially CPU limited, how they perform, and that's only going to be evident when we go hands-on. But, everybody knows Baldur's Gate Act 3, The City, Flight Simulator New York, Cyberpunk 2077, Cherry Blossom Marketplace running about at speed. There are classics. Everybody, all PC testers have their own CPU limited tests. So that's going to be interesting. Also, the length of stutters, Alex. I guess you're looking at that, assuming
wonderful.
Assuming that the inbuilt shader download system isn't covering that. But yeah, what do you think of that spec?
I mean, I think because we're seeing on the AMD side cores that aren't like they're not E-core like in the Intel side where they're actually different functionality and whatnot. We're I think it's actually a much better position for there being the inefficiencies not being so great if misscheduling occurs, which is totally doable. But I would imagine, given how SteamOS is going to be shepherded here by Valve for just 2 select devices at the moment, like very explicitly from them, I think they can manage that better than Microsoft, honestly, who's going to look at all these range of different E and P cores and different Zen configurations over the years with the CCDs and whatnot. I think that since they have a lower amount of devices they're going to be supporting in this OS, that scheduling will be better off. That's basically how I see it.
Okay, the next thing we wanted to discuss was the actual specification of the machine and the reactions to it. There's been quite a lot of reaction from our supporters here, and we're going to be weaving in some of their questions. Let's begin with this one from Spodlude. Hi, gents. With Valve beating Microsoft to the market in a way with a PC console hybrid, who stands best placed to compete in this new category? Have Valve jumped the gun with hardware seemingly incapable of the latest feature set, FSR4? Will the machine learning hardware in Microsoft's new box place them at a significant performance and image quality advantage? Will consumers care? Will Valve be able to break into Xbox's proposed new market segment or vice versa? This question, Paul Calamata, as a big fan of the Steam Deck for the past 3 years, conceptually I find the newly released GameCube very exciting, but I'm disappointed to see a spec that's similar to a 2020 base PS5 being released in 2026. Yet with handhelds, Valve has started working with third-party manufacturers like Lenovo on creating additional SteamOS devices. Do you expect that in a year's time we'll see a Game Station Professional from Asus or Lenovo shipping with a 9070 XT to realize the vision of a zero compromises living room PC console hybrid? Mr. Pyrotech, similar comments here. I don't know. I'd like to see full fat FSR4 on new devices. It's a shame that a device with limited compute power needs to rely on basically obsolete technology. On the controller side, I'd also expect it to support adaptive triggers as the DualSense controller has, but overall this is the only PC I, as a console person, would even consider purchasing. Steam/PC games are usually cheaper, so this could be a nice companion console for a future PS6 and PC for LAN parties. Final comment here from Anxiously Chrono Triggered. Hi, gentlemen! ! How likely do you think it is for Valve to release a GameCube Pro in 2 years' time with a GPU that runs FSR4 natively? Cheers! ! So, Alex, this is an interesting thing, right? Because essentially we have brand new hardware coming in 2026, which is using a feature set which is only slightly improved over what the consoles produced in 2020. 2020, actually, yes. And the lack of support for quote unquote full fat FSR4 is being flagged as a concern here. This isn't a forward-looking design, is it?
No, I don't think it is. I think the CPU is, but the GPU is really the thing that everyone's getting caught up on, and I myself am included in there. First of all, RDNA 2 wasn't good at ray tracing. RDNA 3 was marginally better, but the reason why RDNA 3 in the benchmarks looks so much better than RDNA 2 is because the chips are so much larger. Like you just look at them, like the 7900 XTX or whatever it's a huge GPU, and it's competing with something that was older at that point in time, and so that's kind of why it got to where it was in its ray tracing position, just for being such a big chip. And this is not that big chip; it's one of the smaller ones, right, from that lineup. And then you look at the fact that AMD themselves, Microsoft, Sony, NVIDIA for a long time, Intel for a long time have pivoted to a machine learning future to make up for the fact that rasterization is plateaued as a way to scale performance in games, whether that's power, density, or even techniques that it can be driven by. So they move over to machine learning, and presuming there isn't a native FSR4 port for this device in the near future, that has yet to be seen. AMD is tight-lipped about this when we've asked them about any sort of FSR4 porting question. So I think that is actually a really big negative for this device, is that it's built for games, like it's built for last gen games, and it's built for current gen games with compromises, and those compromises that we tend to see aren't very attractive. Like there's a reason why, I mean, for the longest time, we kind of got a lot of negative comments for this, but not praising FSR2 or 3 in big ways, and instead always detracting against them in our videos. But that's kind of the prevailing attitude at the moment, is a lot of people don't want to be using that technology if they don't have to. So we see comments on our videos about waiting to use XeSS in a game if you're on a RDNA 2 or 3 GPU, or people injecting via Optiscaler, FSR4's port. These are all things that they are at least the dominant mindset from people who are in the know about GPU graphics technology and care about how their games look, that this older technology base is actually a pretty poor start when you think about it. And yeah, that's very negative, but it's the most negative aspect of this device. The OS and everything is wonderful that I'm very interested in, but the GPU, I feel like it's coming out at the wrong time frame. And I can only begin to dream as to why, but it's probably all coming down to price and portfolio availability there from AMD. They only have so many GPUs that they've made in RDNA 4 spec, and one of this size that fits this product with these kind of laptop-y mobile parts, it just didn't exist, really. Yeah.
I get what you're saying about the GPU, because if we look at the full fat version of the Navi 33, it is directly comparable against a prior generation RX 6600 XT. The 7600 was actually kind of panned at launch because it only offered marginal increases over the 6600 XT, which has, I think I'm right in saying it has the same 32 compute units as the 7600. So, to only see a very small step change in performance over RDNA 2 in a device that's coming out in 2026, and then being a pared back version of that chip as well. But more to the point, the fact that the machine learning features are actually quite limited. And to get FSR4 running on it at all, you're going to be using the compromised Int 8 version, not the actual full-fat RDNA 4. Slightly concerning, I think, from that regard. But obviously, there's still a huge amount of GPUs out there that conform to that specification. So it's going to run the games, right? It's just not it's just not really set up for the new paradigm that's going to be coming in a couple of years' time in full force when the new consoles arrive. What do you make of all of this, Oliver?
Well, I think about it generally. I think the CPU is probably fine, and the GPU compute and bandwidth seem generally fine as well. It's a little light, but the spec is pretty good relative to PS5. I guess there are two major areas of concern. One is just like the ray trace machine learning future. I don't think it has very good ray tracing acceleration, especially when we're talking about like RDNA 5 being several times maybe more efficient in terms of its ray tracing implementation on comparably sized chips, especially when we're talking about NVIDIA continuing to lead the way with their RT acceleration in their hardware. In terms of machine learning acceleration, it kind of remains to be seen exactly how well like FSR4 will work on this device, or how well more exotic things will fare on this device, like the ray regeneration, alternative that AMD is introducing to the world with, I think, Black Ops 7, which is out as of this recording. We've not looked at it, but that should be interesting. I don't think it's necessarily there in terms of those technologies. And then the 8 gigabyte limit is more annoying maybe than those other limits, because it feels like it's a more categorical kind of fundamental limit on the hardware's capabilities. I do think that because most games I imagine will have a pre-configured Steam machine spec, that will probably at least help you with this problem, because in games like Indiana Jones, if you do lower like the hair quality and the texture quality, maybe that will be okay. That will probably be decent enough at least. And as long as you're getting that option by default, as long as you're not messing around with the settings too much, that should be okay. And even if games are, like, I heard some people online saying, well, games are catering to a Series S spec. It's like, yeah, well, games are catering to Series S spec, but have you looked at those Series S specs? Like, they're not, oftentimes they're not flattering, right? And they're not, especially not flattering for a device of this general capability, of this compute, of this bandwidth, of all these different aspects. But yeah, I think you also need to just be a lot more careful when you're using a card like this, when you're using a device like this, in terms of balancing your priorities between like ray tracing or ML upscalers or textures or resolution, like anything that eats into VRAM significantly. I do wish they'd use 3 GB modules if that was possible from a cost perspective. Obviously, that would have been nice. But yeah, just definitely one of those decisions that I think will make the machine age a lot less well than it otherwise could. And I'd also note here that we did speak to Valve about the specific memory configuration on the Steam machine, and they confirmed that it uses a 128-bit bus for the GPU with 18 gigabits per second module. So I think that's pretty much as expected for this device as well.
Yeah, I think that's 288 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, which is fine. Let's go back to some of these points being raised in the questions here. What do you think of the concept of a Gabe Cube Pro, Alex? I mean, it's kind of like you don't bring out a new device only to bring out another replacement device 2 years later. The Pro, the Gabe Cube Pro, maybe 3 years, but that's probably not going to happen based on what happened with Steam Deck. There were many opportunities for Valve to put out a Steam Deck Pro. In actual fact, all they did was, it was a great upgrade. They changed the screen, put in faster memory. That was kind of it from that perspective.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I mean, I wish they didn't do that. Rather, I wish they just offered a variety of Steam machines you could get right away when they launched. Like, there were 2 versions of it. Rich said it last week, and I really wish they did it. But if there was a 16 gigabyte version of this in terms of VRAM, I think that would be one that I would rather have more VRAM than more storage space. For example, they have the 512 and 2 terabyte models. I would have 1 terabyte. The advanced model have 1 terabyte of storage and more VRAM. That's how I would do it. But I'm not speccing sheets for millions of people to buy, but that's how I look at it when I would configure a device for myself. And I lament the fact that one of the great things about a PC is when you're building it, this is the one thing that the Steam machine doesn't offer you, is the ability to kind of pick and choose your own configuration for your desires and wants. And the lack of VRAM configurability here is kind of anti-PC like in that aspect, even though it inherits some of the baggage of PC. Like, it's not necessarily 100% bad thing, but split memory is also a compromise in its own right.
Right.
Because if it could just share all 24 of total memory that it has in some way, you wouldn't be nearly as worried, because you would say, oh, well, just spec it, just use for this game, use this amount of VRAM, and for this one, don't. But that's not the way it is. And, I've also seen, just to get back into the VRAM debate, I've seen a lot of people saying like, oh, it's going to be different because they're running Linux. They don't have to deal with the Windows compositor kind of forcing allocations that are suboptimal and reserving space that it goes unused. Those are things that happen in Windows, for sure. I wouldn't deny that, but we should maybe just answer the VRAM question very soon, all of us generally, but just to say the least, like...
well, we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
We can talk about the VRAM, because we got a lot of questions about the VRAM side of things as well. I think that the thing that sort of stands out to me is the whole nature of the design in going for separate CPU and GPU, as opposed to an integrated SoC like Steam Deck, and therefore the benefits of unified RAM. Because that's kind of why we've got this split. We've actually got a handsome amount of memory in this device, right? 24 gigs, but unfortunately it's split between 16 gigs for the main system and 8 for the graphics memory. And so basically I think this must have been a cost decision, and I find that cost decision quite interesting, because the concept of buying two semi-custom chips has actually worked out to be more cost efficient for Valve than actually creating a single chip SoC and having all of the benefit of unified memory. Obviously, there are advantages to having the split setup as well. There's no contention between the two, but I'm not sure the extent to which that would actually manifest. And I guess the other thing, of course, is that you'd probably, historically, it's not been great to use GDDR6 with the CPU in terms of performance. But yeah, that's certainly very interesting. The question of whether these specs are actually the ones that Valve should have chosen have also dominated some of our supporter questions. Let's talk about this one from Brooks Law is Alive. Yes, Rich, exclamation point. I'm an owner of a Steam Deck and a high-end PC, so I may not be the target demographic, but I watched your coverage of the new Steam machine with fascination at the hardware choices. As I watched, I couldn't help but wonder if a Strix Halo APU could have provided multiple benefits, including a more powerful CPU, a more modern RDNA 3.5 GPU, and a larger shared pool of memory that would alleviate some pressure we'll see on the 8 gigs of dedicated VRAM. Meanwhile, memory pricing bears separate consideration. My layman's research suggests that 32 gigs of LPDDR5X could be had for approximately 10% more US dollars than the combination of 16 gigabyte DDR5 and 8 gigs GDDR6. Although we're talking about a premium APU with the benefit of hindsight, do you think it would have made sense for Valve to go up market with this kind of configuration? Some guy person asks, well, it looks like I was right half a year ago. The Steam Machine 2.0 is a real product, but it has a seemingly anemic set of specs compared to the Strix Halo I postulated as the Steam Machine 2.0 SoC. Do you think third-party OEMs will make their own Steam machines running SteamOS with a Strix Halo? There's no reason why they couldn't do that. There's no reason why all of those Ryzen AI Max mini PCs out there couldn't actually be furnished with a version of SteamOS or Bazzite for that matter, probably more likely the latter. But the concept of actually comparing Valve's choices with Strix Halo is an incredibly expensive chip. Like, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on there. It's wildly over-spec'd in some regards for a console-like device. For example, you don't need 16 cores and 32 threads. So there is a version of Strix Halo that is just one CPU CCD. So you'd get eight cores, 16 threads, which would be better. But I'm willing to bet that the reason that Valve went for that particular setup is that it's probably far, far, far cheaper than Strix Halo, and that's kind of why we're not doing it, even though, as Brooks Law is Alive says, it would actually alleviate the problems with memory there.
Yeah, I think Strix Halo, it's a big expensive chip. It's got a big memory interface, very large size. I think 440 millimeters squared or something for the whole shebang. It's big.
It's gigantic.
Big. AMD is pricing it at an expensive level. I don't think I've seen a Strix Halo device below $1,300 or $1,400. And those are for the cut back versions. Those are for like the Max 385. They're not for the 395. But I also don't think Strix Halo is like the product you're looking for necessarily here. Because if you compare what Valve's doing with like Strix Halo, it's not in a universe apart in terms of gaming, at least if you subtract out the VRAM question. I think you'd really want to be looking at like higher end discrete chips. I think you'd want to be looking at like our 9070, 9070 XT. On the CPU side, I think you'd want to be looking at something with like 3D V-cache potentially. I don't think you're necessarily looking to Strix Halo. Strix Halo is a laptop part. It's a handheld part now. It's a tablet part. It's not really like an HTPC part. That doesn't really feel like the right application of it for me.
I do wonder whether the whole pricing situation for the Steam machine is actually going to make people rethink the concept of value in the PC space. Obviously, there's been a lot of criticism of how expensive PC parts are, right? Now, if NVIDIA can't produce really cheap, really performant GPUs, if AMD can't do it, if Valve, which, does have the option of essentially subsidizing its hardware because they get 30% or so of every PC sale. If you still can't make an affordable PC for like, $400, $500, maybe it's time to actually sort of throw in the towel on the whole pricing debate and accept that, well, Moore's Law is alive, but, if you want more performance, you're going to have to pay for it.
Yeah.
What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, I think these are two different devices for two different markets with two different manufacturing concerns. And I think it would have been interesting to see also if that was a product that Valve would make, but it wouldn't be breaking the price barriers that they're aiming for. So it just isn't the machine that they wanted to make at that point in time. But I do like the idea in general in the future of, based upon their inroads with SteamOS in a desktop environment, that other manufacturers like Lenovo and whatnot look to put out higher end versions of what the Steam machine is, perhaps using even dedicated chips or SoCs, whatever they really feel like is necessary.
Yeah. I think Valve are totally on board with the concept of people actually, OEMs rather, manufacturing their own Steam machines. The more SteamOS that's out there, the better, basically. Doesn't really matter who's making the devices. Ultimately, it all funnels you back into Valve's ecosystem where you're buying games on the Valve platform. And I suggest that they would welcome it. I would just hope that there is some consideration put in that, all of the great stuff that SteamOS does actually extend to those devices as well, which, that's been something that's happening in the handheld space, but actually at quite a slow rate of knots.
Yeah.
If you think about it.
There's the Lenovo Legion Go S, which I actually have. I have a version of that with a Z1 Extreme device back in my bedroom over there. I was playing some Spyro before this call. And that's a very polished machine. It is basically as polished, as smooth as a Steam Deck. But obviously, that's like, 3 years, almost 4 years since the Steam Deck launched, and only one third-party complementary device that runs SteamOS. So I'd hope for a more aggressive rollout strategy maybe with Steam Machine. But it remains to be seen exactly how much Valve wants that market share. Because I think if they want that market share based on their own kind of internal engineering constraints, they probably need to partner with a lot of third parties, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's move on. 8 gigabytes of VRAM. It's a topic of Steam Machine specs that's caused a lot of controversy, and we've got a lot of questions from supporters. Darjar Co, in brackets Dan, says, "Happy half fortnight, lads!" Exclamation point. To what extent do you think the Gabe Cube's exiguous 8 gigabytes of VRAM will be facilitated by the relatively low memory bandwidth of Switch 2 and upcoming PlayStation Portable? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Probably nothing at all, because this is a PC-based endeavor. Do you think Valve will have an RDNA 5 Gabe Cube Ultra, maybe with a lunchbox handle, ready to go up against PS6 and Xbox Magnus in 2027, 2028? Feels like it would be a missed opportunity if they did not, as such a large performance gulf would open up. Perhaps at the end of the day, Valve only expects it to have a half-life.
Ha, ha, ha.
Oh, okay. Matt. Hello, gents. Enjoyed your Steam Things coverage. It's a good brand name, a good umbrella brand name there. Enjoy your Steam Things coverage, and so please, Valve, recognize your value. Now you are sovereign, and invited you to their HQ to cover these. You've mentioned slight concerns about the 8 gigs of VRAM being a potential issue on the Steam machine, but I'm wondering that considering the deck seems to be much more VRAM efficient than a Windows PC at the same settings, do you think Valve are using that as a considerable part of their cost/performance judgment? Would that potentially mean for normal raster graphics, it will probably not be an issue, but for RT and upscaling that usually require more VRAM, the system might find itself much more constrained there? As it looks like GDDR6 costs around $28 per 8 gigabyte, was this a cost saving really worth making, or do other factors like changes to system architecture bring the cost up more significantly? Happy independenting! Exclamation point. Magnum Stash says, can you foresee the new Steam machine making use of a more console-like approach to running games to mitigate deficiencies in VRAM capacity? The Steam machine is effectively a fixed architecture like a console, albeit without unified memory. Well, that's kind of like big deal. So can the guaranteed presence of a fast SSD coupled with perhaps one or two quote-unquote Steam machine verified performance options discouraging incessant tinkering be leveraged to reduce reliance on storing assets in VRAM? So, Alex, basically, sort of going back to what you were talking about earlier here, there's basically two camps here. Should have had more VRAM, and don't worry, Valve know what they're doing. Linux is more efficient, it will be fine. Which part do you believe?
Well, I think there should have been more VRAM is definitely the way I feel about it. Now, when 2020 rolled around and 8 gigabytes was there, I was actually disappointed that their 3070 only had 8 gigs at that point in time, because I saw its future scaling being impacted. Because there are things that you cannot scale in VRAM. They're just, your GPU needs them to be the game, to have the game render in front of you. And if a game, for example, is using hardware ray tracing, and more games are, that's the way it is. You know, you look at your Indiana Jones, your Dooms, they all have a lot of, forced RT in them. And in that case, that's me with saying that in a joking way, by the way. These are things you just cannot scale. You can scale textures a bit better. A lot of games don't do it in an automated fashion, though. Most games allow manual user control over this. And sometimes they even load up with improper settings per default. Earlier this year, I talked about Monster Hunter, right? That is still a thing that the game can potentially do. Load up with the wrong texture setting for a poor experience based upon your output resolution. And all these are things where I'm saying you cannot trust every game developer to put the same amount of time and effort into making an 8 gigabyte experience good enough, because they are actually worried about making the PlayStation 5 version good enough quite often or not. And even though the PlayStation 5 has drastically less total RAM capacity than a Steam machine, it has a flexibility in how it's allocated. So they obviously do use things in a system RAM-like way where only the CPU is touching them, but they'll be able to allocate easily 10 gigabytes, maybe even more, depending upon the game, to just GPU-related tasks. And they're not having to double up with those things over a PCIe bus, streaming them from system memory to, into VRAM. So that's although we have those Series S versions, a lot of the times the Series S version settings are not available on PC games, even though I think that's not very cool. And also, you wouldn't maybe want to run those settings because the games in Series S, frankly, look awful sometimes. Like, they really don't look good, especially for someone who's coming from like me, where I've seen it running on like a 4060 and it looks a lot better. So we don't want to necessarily target that kind of experience. And just holistically, I think in general, I thought we were going to be finally moving beyond the 8 gigabyte barrier for GPUs, because I thought potentially with the next launch of whatever RDNA 5 is, as well as the super refresh from NVIDIA, which is MIA at the moment, I thought we would finally be beyond the 8 gigabytes as the kind of low-end mainstream entry here. But with Valve putting out this device, we actually see another continuation of the 8 gigabyte barrier into the foreseeable future. And I presume this will sell, at least to a good degree. So that means we have more GPUs out there that can only address that amount of VRAM. And I actually don't see that as a positive, because I have yet to be fully convinced that developers are good enough and have the resources to dedicate to make those 8 gigabyte experiences universally great without requiring tinkering. And that's a thing. 8 gigabytes doesn't shield you from poor development, whereas 12 could easily do that in comparison. So I find those are all very negative aspects of the device. And I don't think a lot of Linux lower levelness here will be the saving thing, because the texture allocation isn't that fine-grained for that many games. It really isn't. It's usually either it's like the game works well on 8, or it only works well on like 10 and above. It's not like there's this gradation of, oh, you had 300 megabytes more, you can now run the game way better. It usually isn't that way. It's usually the allocations are much larger than that, because the textures, when you start getting into, because they scale textures by 2K, 2K, 4K, 4K, or 3K, 3K, it's like the three-dimensional value there is so much higher, to say the least, in how it scales. So it's not a great position to be in, I actually think, for this device, and it's my most disappointing aspect of it.
Yeah, I'm kind of resigned to the fact now that 8 gigabytes is not going away in the way that 6 gig did.
Yeah, it's such a shame, man.
I'm kind of resigned to that at this point, and it is a bit sad. But ultimately, it does seem to be a value situation. What Valve was saying about affordability is exactly what Nvidia and AMD were saying about their 8 gigabyte offerings with the 5060 and the 9060, and it's a bit sad. But we're kind of on this situation where, well, the vast majority of the library will work fine, right? But looking forward, it's kind of like you just don't know what you're going to get with an 8 gigabyte card whenever a new AAA game arrives. And it's becoming increasingly problematic. And the solution does seem to be, first port of call is to reduce your texture quality, sometimes quite significantly. The other thing is, if this device is aiming to open up the total addressable market, to bring in more mainstream casual players, do they actually know about this situation? Do they know that they could potentially get a much better, if uglier, experience by lowering the texture setting? That's a big question. What do you think, Oliver?
Yeah, that last question is interesting because it does require a certain level of savvy understanding, and not just understanding of like how things work generally, but understanding of games specifically, how games specifically load up VRAM, how games specifically load up memory, in order to make those optimization decisions. And like in a lot of cases, I wouldn't trust myself necessarily to make the right calls out of the box, at least not without like some VRAM capacity notification in the system, in the menu for the game. And to expect that out of like the standard user who's trying to mitigate the fact that they really just didn't ship enough VRAM with this device, I think that's an unreasonable expectation. But there could be some elements to this device that help it a little bit. There could be some Vulkan optimizations, especially for RT. Game scope, I think, can scan directly out to the display to reduce its memory footprint, things like that. But again, in a world in which like you're very gradated in terms of the memory that's being used in games, is that going to be sufficient? Like Alex said, maybe it's not. But I also think like you got a single performance target. Devs could optimize a bit more for 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Maybe they could offer some like Steam Machine specific settings, or at least good Steam Machine default settings. Well, we'll have to see how that goes. I guess it's like TBD on all of that stuff. And again, I also think it's worth restating rather, that in a lot of AAA games, this is not going to be that much of an issue. And in the vast majority of like, your standard esport titles, your GTA 5s, your Fortnites, this is not going to be a real issue. So it really is kind of like this cloistered world of AAA that we're talking about, like the high end of AAA, that's a serious concern. So I guess we'll see how significant of an issue it is in the final device. But I think it's just an unnecessary annoyance and unnecessary hindrance that didn't need to be there on day one. And then as time goes on, when we're talking about 2027, 2028, we're firmly into the next generation of console hardware. Is that really going to be a spec that's going to look good at that point? I don't really think so. Right.
That is an interesting point, right? This is coming in 2026. There's every chance that towards the end of 2027, we could see Xbox, we could see new PlayStation. They will be based on architectures a couple of generations beyond what we're seeing here. And what we're seeing here is only like a sort of very small step change over what we saw with the 2020 consoles. So from that respect, it does sit in a somewhat awkward place in terms of future-proofing. But, again, it's all going to come down to that pricing, I think, and we just don't know what that is at the moment. That's the crazy thing. Okay, let's move on. So this one, I think, is actually something that's kind of gone relatively under the radar compared to the major hardware announcements. And I talked about this earlier. It's the concept that everything could be a Steam machine, because they've introduced an ARM translation layer, which essentially means that you'll be able to run your x86 games, your Steam library, effectively, on ARM devices. The implications for this are massive. We got lots of supporter questions about this one. This one from Peter Leatherbarrow. Hello there. The Steam Frame with its ARM processor can supposedly run APK files. This got me wondering, would it be possible for the work done on the Proton/FEX FEX x86 emulation layer to be used one day to run Steam Windows games directly on Android devices? existing phones, tablets, gaming devices, and then hypothetically a Steam store and a launcher itself? Or does the emulation layer only work when the operating system itself has been built with it in mind? Roel asks, hello, gentlemen, exclamation point. With Valve seemingly being quite committed to supporting ARM, given their involvement/investment in VEX, what are the chances of them using it in future hardware other than Steam Frame? Do you think it is at all plausible for a Steam Deck 2? Is there currently any non-Apple ARM chip out there that would match the desired power performance profile for such a device? 1040 STF asks, with SteamOS coming to ARM, could it mean that Mac silicon hardware could finally turn into great Steam machines? Are there any obstacles that are still in the way? And Don't Be a Richard asks, Valve clearly has put a lot of effort into its ARM/x86 translation layer to support an ARM chipset in the headset. Is this an indicator that Valve would be strongly considering ARM for a future handheld? At the very least, it provides them greater flexibility now in relation to chip suppliers, especially as they target low-powered raw options. It looks like a lot of work to develop the translation layer for just a headset. So a broader adoption of ARM by Valve in its own hardware, or if they make SteamOS available to other OEMs, seems to make sense as a future direction. Also, I appreciate the team will be under strict direction from Valve not to talk about this. So in the interests of discreetness, blink twice if they showed you a Steam Deck 2 during the visit. Well, I'm not quite sure how to handle that, because we've got a biological necessity to blink. So, but no, we didn't see anything on Steam Deck 2. Oliver, let's start with the whole handheld side of things. I don't think that the next Steam Deck will be using an ARM chip. Do you think it will be?
I don't think it will be. I think it will be x86. I think they'll continue with an AMD APU. That's just my supposition here. But the fact that it's possible, and the fact they could ship, again, potentially depending on how this VEX translation layer fares, an actual retail software, not just curated experiences they were showing me, because they did show me games like Ghost Town, games like Moss, games like Hades. Well, I shouldn't say games like, because those were just the games they showed me. But those games were all running in terrific form on the Steam Frame. But I wouldn't necessarily expect that from all software. They did basically say their compatibility was improving day by day, and that it was rare to find a title that was outright not working. And it was, somewhat more common maybe to find titles that had significant performance issues, but they were kind of ironing those out day by day, and they'd improved a great deal over the past year and a half, 2 years since they started working on this effort. So I think that it's potentially viable here. In terms of some of these other questions, though, like, I do find the idea of Macs turning into Steam machines to be quite interesting, but I don't think it's necessary. Like, if you look at GPTK and obviously Codeweavers, they collaborate heavily with Valve on Proton, and they make crossover, right? Which is quite good as far as I understand it for gaming on Macs nowadays. I've used it a little bit myself. I've not really reviewed it in depth, or any similar kind of effort in depth for the past 2 years. So maybe I should go back to that at some point once I have a little bit of free time between all of our Valve escapades and other projects. But yeah, I would like to go back and actually see how that fares in commercial software. And I also think that maybe there's some potential for Valve, instead of shipping SteamOS, maybe they ship some kind of Codeweavers-based translation layer with their titles to run on Macs, and they kind of provide it on an experimental basis instead of giving it that much validation, that much software validation, that much of like a verified program, things like this. Maybe that could be interesting. I'm not exactly sure where you'd go with that, but like, it does feel like a project that's on the verge of commercial viability, just to distribute with individual games, just as like kind of a wrapper beyond what people are doing commercially with games separately. So I think that would be quite interesting. But I don't think SteamOS is the answer there. I think something narrower is probably the answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my concern about Steam Deck 2, I mean, it does have a CPU overhead, this new translation layer, and so does Proton, right? So there's the danger that you'd actually be using a lot of CPU performance just to get the games actually running. Mm-hmm. I think that would be my concern there. I do think that sticking with x86 for Steam Deck 2 makes a lot of sense, because, a Qualcomm embracing ray tracing and machine learning in the same way that AMD is, with a specific kind of gaming focus there. It's not as if Qualcomm has a Project Amethyst set up with a console manufacturer or any kind of gaming partner to actually push boundaries there. Whereas, it's core to AMD's business really to have that partnership with the consoles. I'm not sure it's a good fit, but obviously I do think that you will see people. That's the other thing, of course. The concept of having a separate store on a mobile phone, Steam. I think that's eminently viable. I mean, it's kind of like all bets are off in terms of performance, but it's there if you want it. I think that would be a pretty cool thing. And obviously, those processors are just going to get more and more performant over time. Alex, what do you make about this?
Well, I see this like inroads, like Oliver talked about at the beginning of this video, as a threat to Microsoft's platform. But here it's a bit different because that's wrong language. Currently, there's only one really big company sponsoring all these devices in general that we've been talking about, and that's AMD. And as soon as ARM is able to run more software that was developed for a Windows PC in an x86, x64 environment, well, then a lot of other people that don't have the x86 license become more viable. And I really do think about NVIDIA here, where if this is performant and compatible with a lot of PC games, then this could be a way for NVIDIA to be releasing Steam OS devices in the future or Linux-based devices in the future based upon either their own ARM collaboration, their own ARM manufacturing, or in the future in general, they don't need to use this because maybe they have that Intel cooperation that they're going to be putting out SoCs with too. But I feel like this is just another way to actually broaden the market for Linux to a variety of devices where currently it's really, really AMD dominated. And that's kind of like one of the reasons why it is a little disappointing with the Steam machine, just because there's only so many things they can pick and choose from the AMD portfolio and have it be cheap. Whereas, they can't go to someone else and say, hey, we'll actually make this device with someone else. Could you lower your price? They don't really have that ability. There's not that like competition to allow that thing to occur. And I think this, if ARM was available, it would have a new bargaining chip on the table for hardware manufacturing in general, as well as the user then in the future will have more devices. The closest thing that we haven't reviewed officially on the channel would be the Claw, the MSI Claw 2, I believe it is, from Intel. Like that is like, I would say, the most competitive non-AMD thing we've seen that occupies a Steam Deck like size and power constraint. But that's really about it. And I think we need more of these devices in the future, and that's what I'm looking forward to. And hopefully FAX adds to that.
Right. Okay. Well, it's not the MSI Claw 2. It's the MSI Claw 8 AI. Oh,
my sorry. Yes. The name.
Right here. Yeah. And in terms of this sort of domination of AMD in the handheld space, I've got to admit this Claw is really, really good. It's really, really nice. It's performant sort of between Z1 Extreme and Z2 Extreme. It can go faster. For example, it runs Avatar better, as you would kind of expect, bearing in mind the ray tracing foundation of that particular game. And Lunar Lake is actually a really, really good chipset, really power efficient. It's interesting that, any kind of power draw comparison with AMD is kind of not particularly valid because Lunar Lake actually includes memory power draw in its metric, whereas AMD is separate. And yet this thing at 20 watts is doing some really, really good stuff. In some titles, you could actually max out GPU clock at 20 watts, including the memory. It's really, really good. And obviously, we're expecting Panther Lake from Intel to hit next year. And that's offering, according to leaks, a potential 50% improvement in performance. Whether that actually translates into game performance remains to be seen. But yeah, competition for AMD, more forward-looking designs. I think it's a really, really cool thing. Whether we're going to get that on ARM to the same degree, I just can't really see it at the moment because it does seem to be mobile orientated. But I guess we'll just need to wait and see. But it is really, for me, really going to be interesting to see how all of this shakes out with this new NVIDIA SoC that's coming. that seemingly has a lot of good performance on it. And I guess previously NVIDIA were kind of like banking on the Windows ARM translation layer. But now there's actually an alternative there, and I'm going to be curious to see if it's actually better, if there is actually NVIDIA driver support for it, et cetera, et cetera. But, this is the kind of like the big picture stuff from Valve here. It is essentially, again, hijacking the Xbox ethos. Everything would be a Steam machine at some point, which I think is hugely, hugely exciting. Right, let's move on to some other supporter questions here. We're going to start off with this one from Baz Lurgan. Good day, fine gentlemen. Simple question. Will the Steam machine, similar to Steam Deck, include preloading of shader cache? If so, then this is a fantastic feature which hasn't been touched upon by the previews and trailers to date. Oliver, do we know if it has the shader cache?
I mean, I would be pretty surprised if it didn't, but I didn't hear of that specifically. Right. But on the SteamOS side, I was basically told to expect a very similar experience to Steam Deck, and there really shouldn't be too many breaks in functionality. Obviously, we have like the Steam Machine Verified program. We have analogs for most anything else. And if you didn't have some pre-cached shaders distributed, you'd still have fossilize. If nothing else, you'd still have alternatives. So I don't even think it would be like that big of a deal if they didn't, but I think they will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Microsoft, of course, has its own competitor, the Advanced Shader Delivery. We're still in the background. We are going to be looking at the Xbox ROG Ally X, and we are going to be looking at Advanced Shader Delivery. We were going to kick off actually with a test on, what was it again, Alex? It was Outer Worlds 2. And we haven't actually done the testing yet, but Oliver booted it up and it began with a shader burn.
Suspicious.
Which we didn't quite expect. So I'm going to be interested to see whether, when you actually run the Steam Deck Outer Worlds 2, whether it actually still has the shader burn or not.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. I bet not. I bet not.
I think, Valve has obviously identified an issue with PC gaming and come up with a solution for the Steam Deck. It kind of makes sense to actually have that same solution rolling out to all of its devices. I don't see why it wouldn't, unless there's some sort of fundamental R&D or execution problem in doing so. What do you think, Alex?
I think it's going to be universal due to fossilize, and I think they're going to, depending upon the game, also ones that Valve collect themselves, they're going to pre-ship and let you download in the same way they do for the Steam Deck. So you're going to have those two sources for potential shaders. Because fossilize is basically taking all the shader butlers of the world and giving you the advantages of that, which is wonderful. Another thing that this device will have that you won't get on Windows is the Elden Ring situation, where Valve says, "Hey, these guys don't know how to use the X12. let's fix what they're doing in Vulkan." And that's kind of what they did to get better Steam Deck performance very shortly after release, after Elden Ring came out, while the PC version actually didn't include those fixes at all and kind of still was suffering. So those are things that Valve can do on their end that are actually even a step above, which I already consider fossilize like a huge step above the current way shader compilation is done on like Windows PC. It's like way further ahead. And advanced shader delivery has yet to prove itself as being anything at all, because we have yet to look at it completely. But we still don't have the infrastructure set up where Intel, AMD, and NVIDIA or any of the storefronts have said really too much about it in a big space about how they actually want to solve this problem, unlike Valve, who already has a way to do it. So I think they're way far ahead here.
So for the benefit of the audience who haven't watched Oliver's Battlefield video, Fossilize, it is essentially a kind of crowdsourced shader delivery system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that it? So basically everybody's playing the game and then they're uploading their shaders to a server that redistributes them to users of the same hardware.
It's shader playback. It's different. It's basically saying like, okay, this is what it looks like in its intermediate form, and we're going to give that to the user in a download, and it's going to crunch it after the game installs, and it crunches all the fossilized stuff. And so it's another part of the install process, which I think is genius, by the way. It's not the same as just sending the finished compiled shaders to someone.
Right, because that would be problematic from driver updates, from different hardware, that kind of thing.
Right. It's kind of, I think the name under a similar concept under the Windows banner would be the SODBs, an advanced shader delivery. But the way they are crowdsourced is different. Currently, we only know that SODBs are going to be provided by game developers, and we don't have, there is no infrastructural hinting here in the blogs by Microsoft, at least, that this could be crowdsourced.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Topher Redden. The Gabe Cube has a lot of hype, and Proton has been very impressive, but I can't see how it can really compete in the console space until it can attract games like Battlefield 6, which means solving anti-cheat and some specific targeting of the hardware like a game does on console. Do you imagine Valve see it this way and would be having those conversations? I worry that they don't actually care about that, as they make way more money off storefront from other games and don't need a quote-unquote console seller, so to speak. Oliver, we did actually ask Valve if there's any updates on anti-cheat, and the response we got was basically no updates, and we are compatible with all anti-cheat if the developers actually support it. That was kind of like paraphrasing the response there. So what do you make of this question?
Yeah, so basically the situation's like if you have Windows kernel level anti-cheat, obviously that's not going to work in Linux, and that's an increasing issue, I would say, with games these days. I think you have a lot of competitive multiplayer titles like Battlefield 6, as this user points out, that do have issues running in SteamOS or Linux distributions of any kind whatsoever. Even with all the great technologies that you have there to run games, kernel level anti-cheat is off the table. So you need devs to basically drop kernel level anti-cheat for Linux, or you need them to re-implement the anti-cheat to work in Linux and kind of user space, or maybe even have your own Linux kernel level anti-cheat if you want to. I don't know that there are those solutions at the moment, but certainly the former two solutions, people have dropped kernel level anti-cheat for Linux. They've done other methods of anti-cheat, and that seems to have gone off fairly well, but it depends on them having buy-in from the developers, possibly buy-in from the publishers to make that happen. It's not something that Valve can iterate on, can fix from their end.
Right, okay. Slightly worrying that you'd have to turn off anti-cheat to run on Linux in some scenarios, right? I mean, doesn't that make the game less secure, or is it anti-cheat mostly, or rather cheating, or is that mostly a Windows-based endeavor?
I mean, at that point in time, because these people that do cheat they go to extreme ends to do it, I think it would just become a Linux problem at that point as well too, if they had to drop it. This is an unfortunate situation. You almost wish the world didn't have people cheating in multiplayer games, because it just seems so senseless, because it ends up hurting a lot of other users. Now, this is me just soapboxing for a minute, but I feel like if we had moderated private servers instead of this intense focus on matchmaking, this wouldn't be a problem anyway, because back in the old days, you know what? You cheat, mod just bans you from the server. It's that simple. But because that server infrastructure doesn't exist anymore in the same way, and communities are not organized in the same way they used to be, this is the way we live now. So It's a shame.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on to this question. It comes from Paul Trainer. Hi, DF. I basically bought my Steam Deck with the intention of using it docked, and all I ever use my PSVR for is Half-Life Alyx. So the Gabe Cube and the Steam Frame seem directly marketed to me. What do you think the chances of a release of some big Valve IP to coincide with the launches are? Half-Life 3, VR Co-op Portal. Thanks, guys. VR Co-op Portal. I kind of like the sound of that. Oliver, there's been a lot of conjecture, a lot of rumor mongering about Half-Life 3 or HLX, I believe it's being referred to. But what do you think are the chances of a release of some big Valve IP alongside the devices? I
think Half-Life 3 is more of a possibility than maybe some people think. Just because even though they didn't talk about Half-Life 3, I didn't really ask too many questions about it, but evidently a lot of other outlets thought to pepper Valve employees with all kinds of questions about Half-Life 3. So we know they for sure have nothing to announce on that front. There have been a lot of leaks out of Valve. Valve is a very leaky company, unfortunately. And so we tended, we knew basically most of the significant details about these hardware announcements. But even before I visited Valve in Bellevue, we also know an inordinate amount of details about HLX. I'm probably a couple months out of date on my HLX leaks. But last time I checked, they had all kinds of information on the engine technology, on enemy attack routines, on models, on storyline, on all these different aspects of that game. So I expect that, and a lot of other fairly informed viewers expect that will be announced fairly soon, and it could have a release date not long after. So I think that is actually a distinct possibility. But I don't think anything else in terms of VR games is very much of a possibility, because other outlets asked if there were VR titles in development. I know at one point, I think 3 years ago, Valve basically stated they had a few VR titles in development. It seems like those have subsequently been canceled or at least put on ice, because the answer those outlets got back was basically no. There are no VR titles in development. So whatever software you're looking for, it will have to come from third parties. It will have to come from the existing and future library you're going to see from third parties on the Steam store. It's not going to come from Valve itself, outside of obviously Half-Life Alyx, which is quite excellent. HLX, I think, is a flat screen game, reportedly, according to all the leaks. So that will not be a VR title, I don't suspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Actually, let's talk about Half-Life Alyx just quickly, because we do have a comment from Valve that says that they're looking at it. They're looking at trying to get Half-Life Alyx running in a standalone format on the Steam frame, which is an interesting comment. I mean, the game is quite old now, and you'd kind of hope that it somehow could be turned into a performant enough experience to run on an ARM processor. I guess they could compile it as ARM to save a lot of CPU time for starters. Mm-hmm. Alex, what do you think is the viability there? And I actually speak because I rewatched your video yesterday where you played Half-Life Alyx running on what were the minimum specs, which was basically like a Core i5 7600 actually you used an i5 8400, which basically has more cores, and you paired it with the GTX 1060 and the RX 580. Both of those GPUs, I would venture to suggest, considerably more performant than the Steam frame GPU. So what do you think is the viability of Half-Life Alyx on that particular headset?
I think it would just be lower res visually. And I think it would suffer from many more moments like I talked about when I did that video with John, where you're relying on motion warp essentially for the head to be running at an independent frame rate of the actual game. And I feel like that, I don't like the way that looks, but I think people get used to it quickly. And I think
you seemed okay with it at the time.
Yeah.
It was within a 60 to 90 FPS window.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I guess nowadays I'm not... back then,
this was 5 years ago.
Yeah, my standards have changed over time. As soon as I ran the game afterward on a higher spec PC and liked it a lot more. So that's the thing. So I think you get used to it. And I do think, though, the best way to do it, I think the native port is interesting, but I think the most interesting thing is just streaming over Half-Life Alyx with their new streaming, essentially, that device is going to have. That is actually, to me, the cool new aspect of the frame that I'm most interested in, and how I would use it if I wanted to buy one. And I think that more than a native port, I think that is actually probably the best fit for the frame.
Yeah, that's precisely what Valve told you, wasn't it, Oliver?
Yeah, they emphasized it's a streaming first device. It has standalone gaming capabilities, but they really did emphasize they have a variety of capabilities in this headset. But the streaming, that's the best experience. It's designed to be paired with a computer running SteamOS, or it's designed to be paired with, obviously, the new Steam machine, which is quite nice. Maybe you could even pair it with the Steam Deck. I don't think that would be much of an improvement over the standalone capabilities, but perhaps you could do that. I don't think, this is primarily a streaming headset. Standalone functionality is a nice bonus. That's the way to think about it, I think.
Okay, well, actually, we had a huge amount of supporter questions there, but I think that pretty much sums up all of the main points that were being raised. We've just got one final supporter question, Alex. It comes from PS3 Inquisition. Hello, DF Squad. Ever since Alex's declaration that the PS3 sucks in last week's Direct, I've been contemplating a proper punishment for him. You don't need punishment, Alex. You need gunishment.
Yes.
Anyway, to quote Blasai, perhaps locking him in a room with the PS3 version of Oblivion is only means of escape completing 50 hours of playtime. Just a thought. Thanks for your time. I think it actually means Skyrim.
Yeah.
Where basically the longer you play it, the more stuttering you get. that would be a torture, wouldn't it, Alex?
Yeah. To clarify why I think the PS3 sucks. I just think, because I don't, there's no reason for me to take back those comments. I've always thought this. But the reason why I think it sucks is just because it came out at a time where it was interesting in like a technical way. But as a user who was interested, like if you were interested in multi-platform games, you had to sit around for a good long while before it got a lot better. And, fine wine is nice, but fine wine over 5 years or whatever it took before games started to get a lot better on it in the multi-platform space. I think that means they designed it poorly from a development standpoint. So that's why I think the PS3 sucks. I didn't say anything about first-party software there, just the PS3 as a device, as a console.
I think what's interesting to me is that when we've actually gone back and looked at even the later multi-platform ports, it still doesn't really stack up.
No, it doesn't. Usually.
And I think ultimately the issue is that the GPU is just a lot less capable. Bottom line, that's kind of it. It is almost like how, even if you factor out all of the cell stuff, you've actually got a GPU that's just not as good as the one in the Xbox 360. And it is quite interesting that for all of the really exotic and exciting stuff that the cell was doing, a lot of the first-party titles were basically moving like GPU effects over to the cell to do them because, like post-processing, for example, because the GPU couldn't really cope. This also is having implications on emulation, PS3 emulation right now, where a lot of people are speeding up games with mods that basically turn off GPU effects that are running on the SPUs to actually get, because emulation of the SPUs is very, very challenging. Oliver, what do you think about this proper punishment for Alex?
Do I deserve punishment, Oliver?
Punishment. Well, I think there are plenty of great PS3 experiences, but rim lag, probably not one of them, I would venture. But personally, I played the vast majority of the multi-platform games I played on the 360 that generation, and a bit on PC as well. I did not avail myself of the PS3 all that much. I actually remember getting the PS3 version of Assassin's Creed because I didn't have the 360, and that was like my first sense that this is not really the same. This is not as good because I did get the 360 version I think a few months later, maybe a year later on clearance, and it was obviously significantly better, I would say. And later in the gen though, I think over time it became less of an issue on the multi-platform side, but also it just became less of an issue in general because towards the end of that generation you had so many Sony first-party heavy hitters, and even the rare third-party heavy hitter like Final Fantasy 13 but was significantly better on the PS3, and those games were really killer. Whereas Microsoft did not have nearly the same volume of exciting first-party software on their console towards the end of that generation. So I kind of feel like Sony fixed their own problem with their own software in a way.
Yeah.
Even if the third parties were ultimately not as good on PS3 as 360.
Well, we just have to schedule a time to consider this punishment.
Yeah, you'll have to first find it, like John was saying, with the Xbox 360, finding a non-red ringed early one. It's also not finding a. I do own a PS3, everyone. It's actually over there. You can't see it. It's down there, but it's yellow.
I believe you. Millions wouldn't.
It's yellow. It's got yellow light of death. So that's the way it is.
Anyway, that was the final question there for the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it, with bells for notifications for you, and entirely theoretical algorithmic boosts for us. But really, it's all about the DF supporter program, patreon.com/digitalfoundry. Yes, please do consider supporting our fully independent work. And we just launched a new website, www.digitalfoundry.net. Check that out, please. But that's all from us. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and inevitably, we shall see you next week.